working. So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming along tonight and logging into our webinar. Really pleased to be here to introduce our guest speaker, Julian Martin from Water Technology. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge our funding sources for this project. We've been very fortunate to receive $100,000 in funding from two major grants programs. So one is the Landcare Australia Bushfire Recovery Program, and the other is the Murray-Darling Basin Authority Healthy Rivers Small Grants Program. So thank you to both of our funding bodies. Now we'll just keep everyone's videos off for the moment during the presentation. And then we will, what we'll do is we'll turn them on for the Q&A session at the end. So as we're going through the webinar tonight, I'm really happy if people would like to submit their questions using the chat function on the bottom of their screen. And then at the end of the session, we can run through all those questions and provide you with some answers. And I think that will cover us for now. So if you can please keep yourself on mute as well, that would be appreciated. So the session is going to be recorded and we will be able to provide a recording for everybody after the event so that they can rewatch it or forward it on to others that can't make it. So I'd like to welcome our guest speaker tonight, Julian. Julian and I have got a long history of working together because I used to work with Julian many years ago, pre-kids. So it's wonderful to have you along tonight. Thanks for coming, Julian.
Thanks, Sal.
Julian's a geomorphologist, which basically means he is a specialist in waterways. And tonight he's going to take us through the process of explaining how erosion forms in our waterways and some of the, I guess, the events that have led to our waterways looking as they do at the moment. And he's going to talk a bit about recovery and how rivers repair themselves over time. So it's a bit of a discussion on why our creeks behave as they do and what we can help to do to manage them appropriately. So I'll pass to you, Julian, if you can start your screen share, and you should be able to take over from me and we'll get you from there.
No worries. Thanks, Sal. Thanks, Penny. Thanks, everyone, for coming along and for allowing me to talk tonight. Right. So do you want to continue? Yes. Okay. I'll just make sure you can see my screen.
Yep.
Is that all good, Sal?
Yep, that's great.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah. Just to reiterate, Sal and I used to work together, and Sal used to fix a lot of my mistakes. And since he's been gone, I've been struggling to get through everything. So it was always great working with you, Sal, and thanks for having me along tonight. The talk tonight is largely related to the physical form of waterways and why do creeks behave like they do, and what can we do to manage those creek systems. And when we use the word manage, there's two aspects of that. There's the proactive management and the reactive management element of managing creeks. And sometimes the best thing you can do for waterways is to give them a bit of space and allow them to do what they would naturally want to do. And we'll sort of get through some of that tonight as we go through the presentation. So why does any creek behave and look like it does? And basically, as Sal pointed out, I'm a geomorphologist, and it's kind of a big word, but basically it's looking or studying the evolution of streams and the physical form of waterways and how they've evolved in time, both to natural processes and human interventions, and seeing the result of how they are now and using that information based on the existing condition and those previous conditions, and estimating how they might behave into the future. And geomorphology in its own right is basically a combination of various different elements. So the physical form of a waterway that we see in any one location is usually a function of many other elements that contribute to the way that has evolved and shaped and is what it is today. And that's an example is this image that describes some of those elements. We look at the the channel and the floodplain itself, and there's the geology and the sediment that's associated with that geology. It's the amount of rainfall and runoff that is generated within that catchment, and the geometry of it, which cause the speed of the water and how quickly the water comes down, and also the vegetation. So there's all these interconnecting elements that contribute to a way a waterway functions. And whilst we often consider waterways to have a simple cause and effect scenario associated with the way they function and behave, that's often not the case. But in its most simplest form, basically waterways react through gravity, water, sediments, and topography, and that results in a varying landscape through erosion, deposition, and transport of sediment, and that results in effectively a continuing changing landscape. And that landscape, when we talk about continuing to change, that can happen in a single event, or it could be something that happens over years to decades to centuries. And within that system, some of them are more robust to others to change. So you think of a stream way up in the headwaters where there's lots of bedrock controls, and you think of the streams coming out of Mount Buffalo, for instance, or the Upper King Valley or something like that, where there's bedrock on both sides and there's bedrock in the bed of the river or the creek. And those systems are less vulnerable to change compared to systems further down in the catchment, such as Boggy Creek and 15 Mile Creek. So some waterways are more sensitive to change than other waterways. And we like to look at or think of rivers as being in some state of equilibrium, and over the thousands of years that they've evolved within the particular landscape and setting that they're usually in some form of a balance, and that can change based on various sort of natural or human interventions that tip it out of balance. And this is a common diagram that we use to explain those changes. It's called the Lane's diagram, and basically it's a set of scales where everything at one point in time might be in balance, and then you do something such as increase the amount of water that's coming down the system, and that might occur due to a flood, or it might be occurring due to putting a dam on the system, and say the Snowy system where you bring the water from a different catchment over into another catchment, and that tips the equilibrium of a waterway out of balance, and that can result in changes within the system. And in this case, it's showing that if you increase the amount of water, you can increase the slope of the waterway, and that can cause erosion. And I like to use this diagram to explain how waterways interrelate and how complex they can be, and the responses to those change, how complicated it can be. And you don't have to worry about any of the detail on this diagram, and I forget most of it myself, but basically what I try and use it to explain is that if we change something as simple as the channel depth within a waterway, in response to that change in depth, you have the potential to alter about 6 or 7 different other elements of a waterway. And that just reiterates that we often talk about simple cause and effect scenarios, and in most waterway systems, it's not a simple case of a direct response occurring in response to one particular change within that waterway system. And this is an example that I like to use of how waterways behave in a continuing changing landscape. And this is a LiDAR image of the Murray River around Howlong. And the LiDAR image basically obliterates the vegetation and just shows the topography on the floodplain surface. And what you can see there is that system has evolved through meandering and cutting off various channels and forming new channels and migrating across that floodplain surface, and it results in that quite strange topography that you see there. And it basically shows this: if we try and fix the river in any one position, you can see the dynamic nature of it and how that's changed over thousands of years. And basically in the future, it's likely, even if we try to fix the river in any one position, it's likely to keep wanting to move in that, continually reworking that floodplain surface over the decades and centuries to come. And in our system that we're talking about tonight, the 15 Mile Creek and the Boggy Creek, I'm sure there's lots of people along here tonight that have got a really in-depth knowledge of the history of the systems. I'm based in Wangaratta, just in Rowan Street. And so I've got family in Wangaratta, so I've got a bit of a history of the waterways within this particular area as well. But I just thought I'd sort of reiterate some of the key changes that have occurred within, say, the 15 Mile Creek and the Boggy system over the last couple of centuries since human settlement. And the most obvious change on, say, 15 Mile Creek is seen around Greta, where the swamp was channelized back in the 1800s to form basically a straight channel through the old swamp. And a great example of that is one of the sort of most well-known sites along 15 Mile Creek is out at Greta West, where the Greta West Weir is, and there's the offtake to Middle Creek and 1 Mile Creek system. And just doing a search through Trove, you can read quite a bit about the history of the creek, how various landholders and the council have got together and asking about, what should we do about, the drainage issues and the erosion issues and the sediment issues that have occurred along 15 Mile Creek, and certainly the issues that started upon the channelization of that creek back in the 1800s. In some ways, history keeps repeating itself, and those issues that initiated from those particular works are ongoing today, and we'll talk about some of that today. And that's resulted in quite an active management regime over the decades, and up until probably the late 90s in particular, there was quite an active management regime within the 15 Mile Creek system. But also along Boggy Creek, there's evidence of quite a lot of historic works within that system to manage both the bed erosion processes and the bank erosion processes. And there's a society that I belong to called the River Basin Management Society, and they've digitised all the old state river archive photos, and you can go in there and do a search by catchments and particular stream types, and they have some historic works of particular sites along all waterways across the state, and there's several there from Boggy Creek and a 15 Mile Creek, and this is an example of Gibson property in Moreau. There's a few more sites here. You can see how actively eroding it was in sort of the 50s and the 60s when these photos were captured. Here's some old alignment training works that were installed using old timber and posts, and they're also filling wire baskets with rock to act as impervious groins in various spots. So they're very active and creative in a lot of ways, trying to intervene to manage the erosion processes within the creek. So drawing from that, it's really important to understand, if we do want to intervene within a creek to manage a particular issue or process, that we understand what those key processes are, or what are the drivers that's causing change within a waterway system. And one of the key erosion processes that occur along waterways, and that is particularly relevant along 15 Mile Creek and Boggy Creek, is what we call bed degradation, which is effectively bed erosion processes. And bed erosion is probably one of the most common forms of erosion that we see along waterways. Most waterways in Australia have responded to some form of catchment clearing or land clearing through basically the bed dropping and lowering. And the most obvious sort of feature associated with that is what we call a head cut, which is effectively a little earthen waterfall feature. So just like a waterfall that you might go and visit that's made out of bedrock that erodes maybe 100 meters every million years or something like that. These are earthen waterfall features that have the potential to erode meters or tens of meters or hundreds of meters in any one particular flow event. And this is a really common process that's been occurring along both 15 Mile and Boggy Creek, amongst other waterways as well. We've done similar presentations, such as on Hodgson's Creek out near Tarrawingi, where it's a very similar process. So this bed erosion process effectively moves in an upstream direction. And what happens in response to that is the bed lowers, and then you get undercut banks on the side, and it widens. And if we're trying to manage the primary process to intervene within that system, it's the bed level lowering that we're trying to manage, as opposed to the channel widening or the bank erosion. And so in a lot of these waterway systems, effectively the bank erosion is the symptom of the primary erosion mechanism that's occurring. And so you can have various episodes of these sort of head cuts forming and migrating. So it doesn't have to be one particular head cut. It could be a series of head cuts that form and then migrate upstream, which liberates a lot of sediment and it moves it downstream. And so over time, you tend to get the, one particular area of waterway, and you can sort of, I often use the Greater West Weir again as a primary example of where some points in time that's eroded, then that erosion has moved further upstream and it's resulted in that particular site at the Greater West Weir being subject to heaps of deposition. And so you get these pulses of erosion and deposition that can sort of occur over decades until it sort of until the system finds some sort of semi or quasi equilibrium or something in response to those processes. And also in response to that bed level lowering, in time, the river starts to want to meander and start to develop little bends and curves in it as it sort of responds to that deepening process. And that typically happens not immediately after the erosion, but it's a form of recovery, and it can happen typically, say, decades after that initial bed erosion process has occurred. So that's what this diagram is trying to show. And if you look at it in cross-section view, basically the evolutionary process of what happens there is the top image, you have the stream, not necessarily Boggy Creek or 15 Mile Creek in this instance, but any particular stream where there was a channel to begin with. It has its sort of form that it might have been, say, pre-European, and then in response to land clearing or channelization or something like that, the bed level lowers. And then in response to the bed level lowering, the banks start to erode and the channel gets wider as well as deeper. And then after several decades, once it's sort of reached that wider state that it'll get to, it'll start to form little inset floodplain pockets, and it'll start to recover and form a inset waterway that behaves and functions differently to what it would have done before it sort of reached that disturbance. And there's some classic examples of this sort of process occurring within, say, 15 Mile Creek. And here's an example of some photos to sort of demonstrate what we're talking about. So on the left here, we have an aerial image of 15 Mile Creek upstream of Greater West. And you can see that flow is towards the north, obviously. And that section of creek there would have been channelized in a straight line. And over time, in response to that bed level lowering and widening, the stream started to develop a meandering or more sinuous bendy plan form through it. And that's a process of the stream starting to recover, as we call it. And it needs to do that in order to reduce the longitudinal gradient of the stream. So the steeper the water surface profile, the higher energy the flow and the more likely the stream will erode. And so in response to that, the stream's trying to reduce its energy, and it does that by lengthening itself. And that's why you start to see that windy pattern within the channel profile. And the images on the right there are various forms of Greater West Weir. And so that Greater West Weir, I think, was constructed in the late 1800s. And initially, when they constructed or channelized 15 Mile Creek, and then they channelized the offtake to Middle Creek and 1 Mile Creek for the diversion of water, they didn't need to construct a weir. But in response to the bed deepening that occurred, the 1 Mile Creek and Middle Creek became further disconnected from the floodplain surface. And so more and more water was able to flow straight past the offtake to 1 Mile and Middle Creek in response to the bed level lowering and the channel widening, and therefore more water, there's more capacity within the creek. And in time, they realised that if we want to push water down 1 Mile Creek and Middle Creek to maintain irrigation flows to downstream landholders, they're going to have to install a weir. And so here are a couple of examples of how that weir's changed over the decades from, I think the top image is around the 1940s, and you can sort of see all the sand that's built up around the downstream side of the weir and how small the weir is. And then the bottom image is, I think it's in the 60s. It was undated on the archive website, but it's certainly, there's some existing or remnant sort of elements of this particular structure that's there now. And I think that structure was pulled down in either 93 or 98 in response to being damaged by the floods at that particular time, and it certainly looks a lot different now. But effectively what you can see there is it's an example of those pulses of sediment. So at one point in time it's deepened, that sediment's come down and it's deposited, and then in that bottom image you can see that it's deepened again. And that bed level lowering or bed erosion process that we sort of see in 15 Mile Creek and in Boggy Creek, what can happen is once that occurs in a primary stream, like the major creek, and these head cuts work their way back upstream, that can then trigger the same process occurring in the tributary streams. And so a lot of the smaller tributary networks have also eroded, and that's basically due to the erosion within the primary stream, say Boggy Creek or 15 Mile Creek. And as it's gone past the confluence or the entry point into the bigger stream, that head cut feature's initiated and worked its way back. So you can have, a section of channelization occur, say, at Moore U on 15 Mile Creek, and that can move its way up over decades all the way upstream until it reaches some sort of hard barrier such as bedrock, and it can actually impact the whole tributary network across the catchment over decades. In order to sort of show or to conceptualize some of these processes, I've got a few little videos, and I'll just bring them up. And this is well, I'll show this first one, as long as everyone can still see my screen. And I'll show it a couple of times. So this is just water being passed down a sand bed channel, and you can see that when a stream is sort of cut in a straight line, that in time what it wants to do is it wants to start to meander. And this is, albeit in pure sand, this is a good example of how that process occurs. And so this is a classic example of what's happening along 15 Mile Creek as an example. And to be able to conceptualise, I suppose, how much sediment has eroded and moved through the system, you often see that mound of sediment on one bank on the 15 Mile Creek immediately adjacent the channel. And often that mound of sediment is thought of as being a levee bank, but that's the mound of sediment that they use to that they pulled out of the creek where it's been channelized. And over the decades, you know, following that work, it's sort of inherited this role of being a levee, but its initial intent was just basically a spoil mound. And as a management implication of that having been there and taking on that informal role as a levee, is that in time, when the stream has started to adjust and started to become more bendy, it's actually eroded into that sediment mound and breached that particular area. So that's that image. Another one, which is a good way of visualizing what's happened on 15 Mile Creek. This is a stream in America, and it's just a series of aerial images that they captured between 1939 and 1996. And what you see is the channelization occurred prior to 1939, and it just sort of shows you how that stream has slowly adjusted to become more bendy, more sinuous over time in response to that channelization. But you can sort of see, I just looking at the scale there, you know, it's certainly moved over, you know, a period of 50, 60 years or so. It's moved by, you know, hundreds of meters in some spots. All the way through to 1996 there. So you can sort of conceptualize where the stream sort of started once it channelized and where it sort of finished up 50 or 60 years later. I'll just show it one more time so people can sort of understand how that's worked. And so you can sort of imagine when we put fences up, or if we put a pump site up, or, you know, a bridge crossing or something like that on waterways that have been channelized, that over time that there's a fair old chance that that creek is going to move in response to that channelization. There we go. All the way through to 1996. Very good. All right. I'll jump back in. So bear in mind, as we were saying, that a lot of erosion processes or bank erosion processes occur in response to those bed deepening processes. And one common bank erosion process that we see along a lot of waterways, the Ovens River, 15 Mile Creek, Boggy Creek, King River, all those waterway systems, is what we call lateral migration or meander extension. And basically what that involves is an erosion of the outside bend and corresponding deposition across the inside bend. And that is often, like we were saying before, this is 15 Mile Creek, and that meander extension is occurring directly in response and as a recovery mechanism to that artificial channelization that's occurred in response to those works historically. But we also see it along the major river systems, as we've shown. So this is a waterway, I think, in Queensland, and you can sort of see there that there's, you know, cropping on the outside bend of that particular waterway, and that's the area that's most vulnerable to erosion at that particular location. And that's important to consider when we're thinking about where we place infrastructure or high value crops or waterway crossings and all those things, is to take into account how the rivers are likely to behave and move in response to high flow events or just the ever evolving landscape that we see in waterways. Another common process, we've sort of touched upon it before, is the channel widening. And so we get the bed deepening process, and in response to that, you get the undercut banks on each side, and the banks start to erode on either side. And this is a photo of Boggy Creek. I think it's in the 50s. I can't remember whether that one was dated, but you can sort of see there how there's been erosion on both banks that's occurred in response to that bed deepening process primarily. And so they're sort of three of the most common erosion processes, but I suppose the question is, you know, what can we do to manage it? And as I was saying earlier, there's various proactive things we can do, and there's various reactive considerations that we can also apply. But it's very important that we sort of consider the processes and the stream's ability to naturally recover in response to a particular event as well. And so often the word resilience pops up in a discussion when it comes to responding to natural disasters such as floods and bushfires. And I think the word's sort of been hijacked a little bit. However, it certainly can be useful in sort of considering how we can manage and respond and proactively manage, I suppose is the word I'm looking for, waterways, so that we can bounce back or recover quickly from a high flow event. And so a couple of points here sort of identify what a healthy waterway and a resilient waterway would look like. And we'll touch upon it as we move forward, but certainly, you know, that vegetation coverage, both in the catchment where the water falls and runs off down into the waterways, and then on the river banks and the riverbed and some of those key sections of the floodplain, is a really important aspect of the resilient waterway system. And what that does is it sort of slows the water down, and it provides that binding force to limit the damage that a flood event can cause. You sort of saw some of those photos from the 50s, and you know the banks on both sides of the creek, so are particularly raw in some of those images, and there's just literally nothing holding those banks together. So you'd identify them as being a very low resilient waterway. But then it also, you know, when you provide that vegetation, it also has the ability to trap sediments, and it allows that deposition and organic matter to build up and create that variability, the pools, the shallow areas, the coarser sediment sizes and the finer sediment sizes that all add up to this really complex and messy waterway environment that actually provides that area for your little bugs and your fish to be able to live. And then, you know, in those deeper areas that are created through that complexity, when you have low flows rather than big high flows, it provides that refuge for pools and bugs and all sorts of things to be able to live in while the flows are low. And so they're really a messy stream, you know, full of vegetation, full of timber, all those sorts of elements actually provide the complexity that the waterways within Australia are naturally adapted to and are used to effectively. But sometimes there's sort of it's necessary to intervene within a waterway to sort of manage the processes that are occurring. And you know, 15 Mile Creek and Boggy Creek are two systems where there's been that channelization occur, and in response to that, there's been erosion. And you know that initial work that was done, so the channelization of 15 Mile Creek was done in the 1800s, and here we are 150 years later, and we're still actively managing those erosion processes and the response to that work. And in reality, you know, we'll be managing that for another 150 years, if not longer, purely because of the decision to sort of channelise those swamps and to channelise sections of the waterway on Boggy Creek. And so one of the common ways to manage those bed deepening processes is through what we call bed grade control structures, and they're most commonly seen in the form of rock chutes. And there's a series of rock chutes that have been constructed, you know, starting really in the 70s and 80s. I think most of them sort of 80s and 90s. And there's there'd be probably 30 odd on 15 Mile Creek, extending, you know, from Greeter, even downstream of Greeter, sort of, you know, not far upstream of Glenrowan, all the way through to past Greeter South, and on Boggy Creek, upstream of Moorview, there's a series of them as well. And these structures have basically been put into position to manage those bed deepening processes that we spoke about. And so what happens is that these structures are very important in the fact that there's a photo of one on 15 Mile Creek there. And I'll just run through, I'll show you sort of how they work in sort of a sequence in a second, but you can sort of see if you have that little earthen waterfall feature, in this instance, it's called an erosion head, but it's a head cut, that basically these rock structures aim to provide a stable transition between that higher bed elevation and that lower bed elevation. And when they're placed in sequence, they're also used to, or can be used to create a bit of a backwater or pooling effect on the upstream side. And this is what they've kind of been used. This is the kind of method that they've adopted in Boggy Creek and 15 Mile Creek. And so what they're aiming to do is provide that bed stability, but also prevent that meandering occurring. And so basically it's an artificial form of lowering that bed slope and preventing the stream from wanting to start to become more sinuous. And so that's one reason why these structures on Boggy Creek and 15 Mile Creek are particularly important, and maintaining their integrity is important, because if they were to fail, we're kind of going to likely to see this stream start to meander again. And it's sort of a bit of a catch-22, because as we were saying earlier, that you know, that meandering pattern sort of introduces that complexity. You get the erosion on the outside bend, you get the deeper pools, you get the deposition across the inside bend, and it actually starts to reintroduce that complexity that you may not otherwise have. But conversely, you know, in some points in time, it might migrate beyond the Crown land boundary and start to impact upon freehold land, or it might be impacting upon various pieces of infrastructure that's positioned next to the creek, such as fences and the like. But you can sort of see here that we're starting to pull out a few concepts of, you know, identifying, you know, processes that are occurring in areas of priority that we need to look at when we're talking about where we position infrastructure, where we target revegetation works to account for the erosion processes that are occurring. So the priority within these systems is very much to manage that bed deepening process in the form of the grade control structures, but sometimes we also have to manage the bank erosion that's occurring. And as we said earlier, a lot of the bank erosion that's occurring within these systems is a symptom of that bed deepening. And so you can target just the bank erosion. However, if that bed deepening process is still occurring, it can impact upon the potential success of those works. But sometimes it is appropriate to manage the bank erosion processes out of necessity, or with consideration of how the stream is evolving and eroding. And this is an example here of rock beaching work that was done on the Ovens River following the 2016 floods. And this is just behind Office Works and the Pets Domain, I think it is there. And the river started to erode immediately adjacent that levee that was protecting all the commercial area. out there, and there's obviously houses around there as well. And so that rock beaching was installed to manage that bank erosion process. And just to conceptualize something like this, so the idea behind it is you provide a physical barrier between the act of the flowing water and the eroding bank face. And over the years, like this is a very common erosion control technique, and it's found to have been pretty successful for a couple of reasons. And one is that firstly, you use angular quarry rock. So this rock would have been sourced from the Glenrowan quarry, and it basically works a lot better than, say, river cobbles or river boulders. And that's because it's angular in nature. And so it sort of has this ability to sort of interlock and provide like an interlocking mass, where river cobbles and river gravels are rounded because they've been in a waterway for, usually decades or centuries, and they've continually moved down the waterway, and all those hard edges have rounded off, and they don't tend to be able to form that same interlocking mass like angular quarry rock does. And the other advantage of this technique, both in terms of the rock chutes that we were talking about, where we're targeting bed erosion processes and bank erosion processes, is they're slightly flexible in their nature. So concrete structures or gabion baskets or any sort of rigid type landscaping products, sometimes you see that those concrete blocks and stuff that you sometimes see around the place, they don't have the ability to sort of account for those stream processes that might occur at the edges or the interface of the works and the natural bed and bank profiles. So you can imagine, like, in a higher flow event at the toe of this rock beaching underneath the water, there might be a bit of scouring or something that occurs in a high flow event, and those individual rocks have the ability to fall into those holes, and they sort of self-heal to quite a significant extent. If that was a concrete structure, there'd be a void form underneath it, and eventually that would lead to the cracking of the concrete and the failure of the structure. Another common technique that we sort of used to see quite commonly all the way in the 1800s up to the 1960s and 70s even, is log revetment, and it's become quite popular again of recent times. And the success of this technique sort of relies on, one, being able to find a suitable source of timber, but two, the nature of that timber as well, in terms of being able to position it hard against the bank face. And so effectively, log revetment works in a similar way to rock beaching, where you're trying to provide that physical barrier between the act of the flowing water and the bank face itself. And this is an example of that particular technique being applied in Little Snowy Creek up on a tributary of the Midamita River. And this was in response to the 2016 floods, and they were able to source this timber from the hardwood thinnings from a pine plantation, I believe. But other examples are, in Tasmania, for instance, where you have a really high forested catchment, and you have a big flood come down. There's often a supply of timber that deposits across the floodplain surface that landholders sort of pile up and burn, and sometimes you can take advantage of that timber. Or in a bushfire, there might be some burnt timber that's sort of fallen over. The CMA are using that technique in some of their fire recovery works up in the upper Murray catchment in both the Cudgela and the Narrial Creek systems at the moment. And it can be quite a successful technique. The disadvantages of it are, traditionally in the 50s, they sourced timber from the floodplain. So they might have big red gums or big grey box or something that's sitting next to the river, and they knock them down and put them in the river. And that's, we've gone away from that. Obviously, you can't chop big trees down anymore to use them like that. And it was effectively robbing Peter to pay Paul. But this is a pretty good technique when applied well. Another technique that that we've got that you might see on Boggy Creek and 15 Mile Creek is pile fields, and these they act very differently to the rock armouring and the rock beaching. Effectively, what these try to do is slow the water behind as the water passes through those individual pile field rows. They try and slow the water down and create deposition, or at least slow the water to the point that they don't actually cause erosion. And there's various sort of materials that they've used over the years to apply this particular technique. And out of interest, when the railway shut down in the 70s, there was a cheap supply of railway iron, and you do commonly sort of see this across northeast Victoria, and you don't typically see it anywhere else across the state. The other element that I'd like to talk about in terms of that resilience and intervention techniques is certainly vegetation establishment. And as we sort of spoke about before, the role of vegetation is sort of twofold. And one is that it provides that physical barrier within a waterway that the flow has to pass around and through. And you see white water as flow passes over rocks or around vegetation and stuff. And basically that's the water using up energy, and it's using that energy to pass through the vegetation. And if it wasn't using it to pass through that roughness, it would be using it basically to induce erosion on the bank. And the example that I use is you grab a litre of water and you pour it onto a piece of shag pile carpet, and it passes through very slowly. But if you put that same bucket of water on a sheet of glass, it flows off it much more quickly. And so it's very important that vegetation is there to basically reduce the erosion potential along waterways. The second element of how it works is through the anchorage of the roots. So effectively it provides that binding force in which it protects the bed and bank material. And the vegetation establishment, the areas that it's very important to place them on is not necessarily just on the top of bank or beyond the top of bank, but certainly revegetation programs. If you're aiming to target erosion control as one of your objectives, is to plant that vegetation where you're seeing the erosion occur. And that can include the bank toe, the bank face, top of bank, and beyond the top of bank. And here's a few photos of some of those rough streams that we were talking about, where they look a bit messy and a bit complicated, but they provide that roughness and that resilience. And finally, I've just got a few photos that sort of consider those erosion processes and where we place infrastructure as an example. And so here's a couple of examples of an outside bend of a waterway, and on the outside bends you typically have your deep pools, and there's a pump shed as an example on that outside bend. And that's the area that we spoke about that's prone to erosion, and it can be at risk in future flood events of falling in. And similarly, you can sort of see often, as we say, you put a waterway crossing over a creek or a river, and you make that assumption that the river is always going to pass under that bridge or waterway crossing for an indefinite period of time, and it's often not the case. And so that image in the bottom right is Gentilani Bridge out near the caravan park there, and that was, I think, 2010 from memory, when the river eroded across an outside bend, and it took out that last section of the bridge, and it was out of action for many months. And the image on the top left is an example of an electricity pole. After the 2016 floods, we were involved in work in Tasmania, Victoria, and Queensland in particular. And each state, I reckon I saw this at least twice, where a power pole, electricity power pole, was positioned on the outside bend of a river. There's been erosion on that section of river. The power pole's fallen in like this, and between the time where we've initially assessed it and we've gone back to have a second look at it, the power pole was positioned another 2 meters back off the top of bank. And so that risk of falling in is going to be relevant in the next flood event as well. And finally, one of the things to consider is even if you position something on a waterway and you're comfortable, or you want to take the risk that that it might erode, and you put infrastructure there. This is an example of someone's backyard that was positioned on a waterway, and it subsequently eroded. And because of the position of their backyard, it made it really, once it eroded, it made it really difficult to then get access to be able to do any works. And so, often these works are placing rock or timber, involves big excavators and big trucks and stockpile areas and going back and forward. And in this particular instance, it made it very difficult to protect this person's private property without providing sort of significant damage. And just finally, when it comes to monitoring, so monitoring is a really powerful tool for landholders and for various utility companies, for instance, when they're trying to monitor erosion and the position of their infrastructure. And these days with mobile phones, it's really easy to capture a photo to monitor, what's going on at a particular site. And there's some good examples of sort of how to capture photos, and I suppose how not to capture photos when you're trying to work out how quickly a site's eroding or if it's eroding at all. And as an example here, we've got two photos of two different sites, and you can sort of see on the left, the photo is sort of captured from the opposite bank looking through at the site. And you can't really get a great conceptualization of the bank profile and how much it might retreat in any one individual photo, just on the basis of where that photo's been captured from. But the photo on the right, it's been taken from the top of bank, and it's looking along the bank in reference to a fixed position, such as the fence in this instance. And you can sort of watch that and take repeated photos, say annually or after each high flow event, and you get a really good indication of how quickly that bank's eroding. And that's largely it, so we might stop there.
Thanks, Julian.
Okay.
That's great. I really loved your earlier photos taken from the archives of those shots of Boggy Creek and 15 Mile Creek, and I'm very pleased to say it doesn't look quite as bare as that now, and we have a lot more vegetation on those creek systems, which is great. I think where Landcare is positioned is that we're really trying to take that proactive role in managing the vegetation and health of these waterways, so that we don't get to the point where we need that investment in those really costly rock beaching and rock shoots, because I think we've come through a bit of a time where there's just a lot less money around now for those sorts of repairs. So I really work with everyone to try and encourage them to be preventative in how they manage their waterways, because there's no get out of jail free ticket now where we can just ring the CMA and say, I need rock on that bank, and they come. So vegetation's one of the areas that Landcare can focus on. We seem to, we can always get money for plants, and sometimes we have money for fencing too, which is fantastic. So I do want to touch on what we've got as grant funding at the moment. But before I touch on that, I had a really good question come through the chat function about your presentation from Anthony, who just asked, do the rock shoots need to be maintained, or do they serve their purpose and then naturally fall to bits and get gobbled up by the stream and the sediment? And it's a great question. So I'll throw to you on that one.
That is a really good question. So often the rock shoots are basically put in there as something that's provided to, say, manage stability for about 20 years. They're sort of given a design life of around that particular time. But in that time, it's also really important that we get vegetation established to provide that long-term stability. So a lot of the intervention techniques that we apply, whether they're rock shoots or rock beaching or timber pile fields or the timber revetment that we sort of went through, it's the vegetation that aims to provide that long-term stability. So in time, those rock shoots do tend to the individual rocks become dislodged and they move around a little bit, and they can either fall into a state of disrepair or the vegetation can take over that role eventually to manage that intent, the original intent that they were there to provide. But a lot of these structures that exist on both Boggy Creek and 15 Mile Creek have been installed now for 30, 40, 50 years, and they haven't completely failed. They're still playing a significant role, and in some instances that's really important because we haven't sort of necessarily got that vegetation established in those particular areas to provide that long-term stability. And so immediately upstream or surrounding these structures, eventually they will fail. So it is important, as areas of priority, for instance, or investment in terms of revegetation activities, that those areas are considered for that strategic long-term, resilience viewpoint. And certainly, Sal and Landcare and the Northeast CMA have been active over the years in trying to get those vegetation buffers established in those areas.
Well, it was one of the things that was found in that December 2019 flood event that we had just north of Wang, where there was that massive deluge of rain, and there's a whole heap of rock shoots on Hodgson Creek and Boggy Creek. And after that event, a number of them unravelled and are looking, pretty disparate. And it was the ones that had the vegetation alongside of them that performed the best and actually performed the role that they were there to do. And so the primary recommendation out of the study that was done on those creeks was that, a lot of those rock shoots had that investment, but never had the veg following up to actually protect them and keep the whole system working. So vegetation, really important. And that's a really nice segue for me to talk about what we have available to try and actually help people. So can I ask you to stop sharing for a minute, Julian, and I'm just going to flick up some slides just quickly to wrap up, and then we'll see if there's any more questions at the end. So I just will run through what we have available to help our members with. So hopefully we can see. Can you confirm with me, Julian, that you've got a slide? Okay. Is my screen sharing, Julian? Can you confirm? No. I haven't lost everybody, have I?
Yep. Yes, Sally.
Great.
Yes, see it.
So at the project area for our project is pretty much the upper catchment and a couple of waterways. So all of Boggy Creek, all of 15 Mile Creek, some of the tribs in the upper catchment that flow into those systems, and also these areas of remnant vegetation along the hill slope, which are covered by our bushfire recovery grant. They're shown in yellow here. What we've got and what we're trying to do is to prevent our native vegetation being smothered by a lot of weeds that are emerging through our riparian zone. So we've got a lot of blackberry that's just getting out of control and is taking over all of the really good re-veg work that's happened, particularly along the upper 15 Mile Creek and upper Boggy Creek. So we would like to provide support to our members to actually tackle these areas that are typically a bit harder to access and manage. We would also like to continue the investment from some of the past programs that have happened on these waterways to control our invasive weeds. So a couple of the things that we're actually looking at is these invasive black willows. There's not a lot left in our catchment because the CMA has had a few programs to actually remove them, but we are still seeing them pop up on gravel bars as scattered individuals. So we are trying to target those as well. And then we're also like to tackle our new and emerging weeds. This one's periwinkle. I think it's Tradescantia, and it's popping up all over Boggy Creek upstream of the Red Camp Bridge. We've got big patches of it. It's hard to manage and it forms like a real ground cover mat. So our program is there to support people to get on top of some of these weeds. And what we're offering is some contractor support. So we will get contractors in to look at these areas and target the weed control. Now it's in a cost share arrangement with Landcare. So the landholder pays 30%, Landcare pays 70%. So that equates to a cost to the landholder of around $36 an hour, plus some GST and chemical for a spray crew, which is one vehicle, 2 operators. They've got fantastic 200-metre long retractable hoses, and they can get through some big areas pretty quickly. So we're working in partnership with the landholders, and we are trying to follow up and form that agreement with our landholders that we want you to do that, follow up weed control for a period of 3 years once we've been through. So we're sort of looking at ways to help you get some of these really difficult sites under control, and then we're going to leave the follow up weed control to you. We also have some funding for pest animal control targeting deer, if people are interested. And then we would like to also offer some fencing and re-veg incentives, which we have available through both of those grants. So I don't have a lot of money for fencing. We've got a budget for about 1 kilometre of fencing at $6 a metre, but we've got a lot of plants available. So the Landcare group will work with you to come up with a planting plan for your site. We'll look at species that are suited to the waterway, and that will help to provide those vegetation functions that Julian was talking about before. So things like river bottle brush, ovens wattle, river tea tree, they're really great planted on the bank face and low on the bank. And the co-contribution from the landholder is that those shrubs will be just 50 cents a unit for you, and that will get you a plant and a guard. And we can use that money to help fund the program and also to help supply top-up plants for you in the following winters. So it's a really great program. We've got a really good budget for the weed control, and we'd encourage everyone to get on board. The spraying is happening between February and April, and our fencing has to be completed by April, as one of these grants actually needs to be wrapped up by then. But the planting, doesn't need to happen until winter. So typically from June to August, depending on conditions, although the way our year is panning out at the moment, we might be able to plant as early as April, is the way it's looking. So the application process is very easy. We're trying to make it as easy as possible for everyone. This is a 1-year program only. Our funding is very short. We were really lucky to get this. So get on board as soon as possible, as we're allocating funding to sites now, and I've got the contractors starting in the next week on those 2 creek systems. So you can fill in your details on an expression of interest form. That's the website link here, or just give me a ring and have a chat, and we can work through what your needs are, and I can pop out and see you, and we can actually have a look at your site together. So as part of the project, we'll try and get you some further resources to help with whatever you need on your frontage. So in some cases, people have been asking about plant ID and learning more about what their natives are and what the weeds are on their frontage. So I've got a lot of good information to support that. And we might also have a little short webinar in the next couple of weeks where we actually look at what the really typical plants are that we're seeing on our waterways and what's good about them, and how we can encourage these good natives and which weeds we need to really focus on. And as I mentioned earlier, we'd like to get Julian out on site to actually have a look at these waterways and give people that opportunity to ask even more questions. So there's a few things in the pipeline to help you, further enhance your, knowledge over time with waterway management. So that's it for us. And I know we've gone a little bit over time. It's now 8:40, but I'm really happy if anyone else has any further questions that they'd like to ask before we wrap up our session. Julian's still here, and he's happy to answer any questions that you may have. Otherwise, I'm really happy if people want to get in touch later on and we can have a chat one-on-one. All right, here's a question from Kerry. Thanks, Kerry. Is there any research on allowing sections of creek to revert to swamp and any resulting benefits that this may provide for fire reduction, i.e. re-establishing riparian zones? I think it's a really good question. I'm not sure if there's research on it, but I know that the field of landscape rehydration is something that's currently being looked at really widely, and it goes back to sort of re-establishing some of these wet areas and getting better connection from our channel back onto the floodplain to rehydrate and spread the water back out. So there are ways in which we can do that. There are lots of ways that we can do that, and depending on how deep our streams are incised as to how easy that is to do. So some sections of Boggy Creek that now have 6 metre deep banks, we're going to have a very hard time ever re-engaging those floodplains. And as Julian mentioned, they're now forming little floodplain insets inside the bigger channel. But certainly the concept of landscape rehydration is very much around creating smaller microclimates with moisture on individual properties and how that can benefit production and wildlife in those areas. So if anyone's interested in learning more about that, you can have a look online and look up the Malone Institute. There's a lot of good reading to start there. And a couple of the neighbouring land care groups, Cardboard Bob and Warra is going to have a workshop in March or April, a 2-day workshop where we actually look at this landscape rehydration concept in more detail, which will be fantastic. So Julian, do you have anything you'd like to add to that question about the swamps in the landscape?
Can you hear me, Sal?
Yep.
Oh, great. Excellent. Sorry. Not really. I thought you did a great summary of it. There is certainly research out there, and there's certainly good sort of evidence around how slowing water impacts or positively impacts upon waterways. And as an example, like the Adelaide Hills, there used to be these swampy areas and what they call chain of pond systems that have been channelized. And in response to that, the River Torrens through the Adelaide Hills used to permanently flow, and because of the erosion that's occurring there now and the flashy flows that it has, the river no longer permanently flows through the Adelaide Hills. So that's an example of how that erosion across the catchment can impact upon that trunk stream. And
which is basically a drying out of the landscape, and that's what we've done with our drainage and channelizations. We've effectively, in our rush to remove water from the landscape, we've actually dried out a lot of our floodplains, and that's then created, hotter and harsher climates for our, plants and crops to survive in. So the concept of rehydration is really, it's a really important one, and you can do it at a farm scale, and then you can do it at a reach scale, and probably at a catchment scale, depending on how many people get on board with that principle. So
and there's certain spots where, say in Boggy Creek and 15 Mile Creek, where it's more possible or realistic to do something like that compared to other spots. There's in Greater South, near the bridge where I can't remember the name of the road, is it Greater Kilfeera Road, and the creek passes over the road there. Immediately downstream, that creek is eroded so much that even in a 100-year flow event, the water no longer flows across the floodplain. But in other spots further upstream and downstream, it's far more connected to the floodplain.
Yeah. Well, I think we might wrap it up. Thank you so much, Julian, for your summary. I hope everyone's found it really useful, and I'm happy to take some feedback. Shoot me an email and tell me what you thought and what other information we can help to provide you with to help, your journey and knowledge and understanding evolve with your waterway. So thank you, everybody, for hopping on board tonight. And we do have another 2 sessions coming up on our following Mondays. So we've got a climate, sort of understanding local climate webinar next Monday night. And then we have, hopefully in 2 weeks from now, a face-to-face session looking at beef cattle farming and future impacts of climate change and how that may change your farming enterprise. So it would be great to see you at another event in the future. And thank you everyone for coming on board tonight. Thank you.